at the core of our facilitation and education approach is are kind of the values of curiosity and empathy. And those are values that are guided no matter who the young person is that we're working with and who the facilitator is who's working with those young people. So obviously we have a kind of ethos within the organization overall, but then we also have our facilitator body. We have around 15 facilitators who we work with, and they all have obviously varying different identities and backgrounds that they're coming from. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this idea of positionality as facilitators, like what is our identity and how are we bringing that to the space, and how does that potentially change and interact with our like kind of how we're working with each young person in that space. But what I would say at its core, we're always coming back to that curiosity and empathy. And one of the things that we always come back to is the idea that who we are as a facilitator, or who the young person is that we're speaking to, doesn't decide what we can and can't talk about in that space, but it does shape how you have that conversation. So not the fact that the conversation is happening, but how that conversation is held. And again, like therefore then coming back to that curiosity and empathy, asking questions, creating a space for understanding, and genuine curiosity is so important. And I'd say like for us, the approach that we're taking is understanding this culture overall. And when we're thinking about the difference, for example, between how we might approach this with girls and boys, we're really wanting any young person that we work with to see how they are connected to this issue of gender inequality and gender-based violence, and that they experience harm as a result of that culture. And a big misunderstanding that we come across, and actually it's something that Jean, you mentioned when you introduced the work that you've been doing, is that of course men and boys are affected by these issues too, and also may well experience forms of sexual harassment and sexual violence as well. And they're also affected by gender inequality in other ways. And we talk a lot about the way that the expectations that we place on men and boys around masculinity. We think a lot about the pressures that they face and how that can result in things like not speaking out, not seeking help for mental health, and other ways that it harms men and boys as well. So it's not necessarily that we take a different approach, but that we try and find ways with each young person to connect to this culture and this issue overall. And then the next part, that's the empathy piece. So once that young person has made a connection themselves, it's about how they step into the shoes of other people to understand how other people are affected by this culture too. So there's lots of different ways that we might go about doing that. But I keep mentioning them and I'll keep going back to it. But the curiosity and empathy are kind of our like bread and butter of how we do that at Bold Voices, to really like make sure that all young people are feeling engaged in that conversation and can connect to it. And I think also on the second question as well, intersectionality and thinking about how different parts of identity affect this issue is really important in this work. So by that, I mean, if we're touching on parts of identity like religion, like race, like sexuality, like class, and then obviously also gender is going to be one of those parts of our identity as well. So we're always thinking about how all of those parts of identity shape and change these experiences. And it's not just the experience itself, but then as Jot's been talking about, as Elsa's been talking about, it's also about how you might receive support in the aftermath of that violence. It's how you might seek out certain organizations, how that might be received, the kind of attitudes that you might face when you are seeking help, all those different things that might happen. So that's a really important part of the work we do as well, and really centering that idea of intersectionality in that education and in our approach to that education as well. As I mentioned earlier, we do work with adults a lot as well. So whether that's staff or teachers in schools, as well as parents and carers, I would say on the whole, most of the adults that we come into contact with in our work are very much on board and engaged with understanding it. And I will say that we've seen a change in that in the last few years. We've been doing this work at Bold Voices for 6 years now. And in 2021, there was a real shift in approach to this issue within the education sector in the UK. People might, well, if you think back to 2021, you might remember some of the things that were happening in the media around gender-based violence and violence against women and girls at the time. In particular, there was the case of Sarah Everard, and that kind of led to a real big conversation about violence against women and girls in the UK. And at the same time, there was a conversation happening within education and amongst young people. And there was an Ofsted review into sexual abuse and sexual harassment in schools. And we saw this real shift, this real moment. And one of the things that the Ofsted review stated is that school settings should assume that online sexual abuse and sexual harassment are happening in their school settings, even when there are no specific reports. And that was a real change for the education sector, because before that point, it had been very much like, oh, we don't get any reports of this, therefore we don't have this problem. And after this Ofsted review, there was a shift in attitude of actually hearing these reports is a good thing. We know it's happening. So if we're not getting reports from young people, that means that they don't feel comfortable reporting, or they don't know where to report, or they don't know what to report, lots of different things. And so that shift was a really important one that happened, and it led to a lot more openness from adults in the lives of young people to understand this issue better. So we do approach the conversation slightly differently with them, but we're still building knowledge and we're still building curiosity and empathy. We try and really upskill teaching staff to know how to challenge these different issues and to know what to challenge, and in particular that prevention-led approach. So most teaching staff that we work with know that if a report of gender-based violence comes to them, or even if they witness a form of gender-based violence, sexual harassment or something in school, they know to report that and to deal with it. But the things that are often missed are the stereotypes, the attitudes, the day-to-day norms that are just going on very normalized, very unnoticed within school life. So those are the things we really focus on, being able to notice them and then being able to challenge them, and to challenge them in a way that centers that curiosity and empathy first. How do we create a space of call in and like, let's learn together, rather than it always being a sanction and a punishment, but actually how do we learn as a school community? And that's a really important part of that approach with adults, is upskilling them and growing their confidence to hold those conversations in that way. So yeah, it is. One final thing to say on the intergenerational thing, I think, is that we sometimes do see a real distancing from adults who we work with, who might say things like, oh, I just don't understand why it's got so bad with young people today. Like, it wasn't like that in our day. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to say that because we spend a lot of time thinking about the online sphere and how gender-based violence exists online for young people, which it does. And obviously that is kind of a new form of gender-based violence that a lot of adults maybe didn't experience themselves growing up. So that can make it feel quite distant. But I think also, once we start building knowledge of what we actually mean by gender-based violence, a lot of adults start to notice that experience in their own lives of, oh, wait, hang on a second. No, I do notice the fact that sexual harassment was very normal when I was growing up, and that those stereotypes and norms and attitudes were just part and parcel of daily life. So we try to help adults to see a connection to the issue, rather than pushing it away and being like, this is not something that I experienced. And that can be difficult, and that takes time to kind of work through that. But yeah, that's definitely an important part of the work as well.